Hello, literarians. Welcome back to the Literary Lori YouTube channel. I'm Literary Lori, aka Lori L. Tharps. I am a traditionally published author of both fiction and nonfiction, mostly nonfiction, but I moved to the south of Spain so I could relaunch my career as a full-time novelist, and that is the journey I'm on. But today specifically, I want to talk about in this video how we writers and even readers should be approaching the classics. All right, let's get into it. All right, so as a writer, I'm sure you all know this is not rocket science, but as a writer, it is important that we read, right? The most important thing that a writer can do to improve their craft is read, right? The more you read, the better writer you'll be. And I would posit that most writers started out being readers first. They started out loving books, reading books, being so moved by books. They're like, I want to write books, right? I mean, and I know everybody's journey is unique, but for the most part, most writers are readers. And historically speaking, before anything like an MFA program even existed, the way a writer became a professional writer was just to simply read the masters, right? And imitate them, much like any other art form, right? You would study the masters, imitate the masters until you could, come up with your own style. And it's no different for writers, So, that being said, growing up, I went to a college preparatory high school. I went to a liberal arts women's college. And for the most part, the idea of great literature was literature written by white men. Yes, preferably dead ones. So dead white men were on the curriculum for the most part. I'm sort of aging myself because I know that's changing in a lot of ways, but still, that was what the classics were considered, were books by dead white men, okay? And I didn't really question that until I was in my early 20s. I had gotten out of college. I was living in New York City, discovered the Brooklyn Public Library, and realized that there were so many books written by not dead white men that I started on a journey of reading as many books by people of color that I could, and I'm still on that journey. That being said, I really want to improve my craft as a writer. As I mentioned, I am trying to reestablish myself, relaunch myself as a full-time novelist. And I know what kind of novelist I want to be. I mean, I know what kind of novels I want to write. If I have to put them in a particular category, I would say book club fiction. The type of books I want to write are juicy, dramatic. They are the types of stories that make people talk, that make people discuss to decide like who was right, who was wrong, what would I have done in that situation? Books, stories that are deeply rooted in real lived experiences. They may or may not have a little magical something in them, but again, I would categorize them as book club fiction, dramatic, grounded in reality. I would say family dramas are somewhat of my specialty, if you will. Don't mind a little romance here and there because romance is definitely part of my literary DNA. So it occurs to me, obviously, that I should be reading authors who do that type of work really well. And I do that. But last year I thought, well, everybody says you should study the masters. And I've always taken that to mean, again, contemporary book club fiction authors. But again, last year I decided to push myself a little bit more and to get away from my own bias against the classics, thinking the classics had to be dead white men. And so for my reading challenge, and I always give myself a reading challenge. I don't do what these crazy book club girlies, booktube girlies do where it's like, I got to read 150 books. That's crazy. I'm a writer. I'm a professional writer and a writing coach. And so I am always reading my own manuscripts for whatever book I'm working on. And I'm reading the work of my students and my clients. So trying to read more than what I always say, like 24 books is my goal. Is in other words, 2 books a month. So my reading goals are not quantity, it's quality. And so I always make myself specific assignments. Like I want to read this year, for example, I have I want to read one book by a Native American author. I'm reading at least 2 books off my shelf that I already own. But one thing I added last year was to read a classic. It's to read a classic so that I can study and learn from the quote unquote masters. And what I mean by that is we consider books classics that people continue to read year after year, and they're still relevant. They're still considered great literature. There's still something to learn, not just from the writing, but from the content itself. They hold up to the test of time. So I said, I'm going to read a classic, but interpret it in a way that makes sense for me. So last year, I read The Count of Monte Cristo. Yay! It's a big fat book. Let me see, how many pages is this? This version of The Count of Monte Cristo is over, it's over 1,200 pages. So what I wanted to do was to share with you the lessons I learned and how I approached reading the classics so that you too can incorporate this methodology into your reading and writing practice. Okay, so I call this consuming the classics. So the first thing was to really select a classic that was aligned with my own beliefs and my objectives as a writer. Again, I'm reading classics because I want to be a better writer, and I think there's obviously something to learn from reading the masters. So the first part of that is just because I want to read the classics doesn't mean I have to throw away my other requirements for the books I choose to read. One of my main requirements is to read books by BIPOC authors, right? So when we talk about classics, I'm already throwing away the quote unquote white male authors, because that is part of my idea of learning and being a good literary citizen, because I read so many white authors between age, 3 to let's say 25. I feel like I need to catch up. Therefore, even if I'm going to add reading the classics, it still has to align with my values as a reader and a writer. So first part was still want to make sure that I'm reading writers of color. I'm reading writers of colors. That's part of my values. And the second part is I want to read books that are going to make me a better writer in the genre that I want to write. So dramatic, maybe with a little romance, things that are what one call book club fiction, where you have scenarios or characters that make people, not sure what would they do in the same situation, leaves a lot of room for discussion. Okay, so The Count of Monte Cristo, for those of you who aren't aware, was written by Alexander Dumas. Alexander Dumas was Black. If you use the one drop rule, he was Black. So Alexander Dumas was the child of a mixed race, Haitian mother, white French father, but he was known as a Black man. In fact, he was very well known because he was a soldier in Napoleon's army. And there's an excellent book called The Black Count that is all about him and his military success. Okay, so fun fact, his name was Alexander Dumas also. So there was Alexander Dumas the father, and then Alexander Dumas the author was, we would say junior, but that's not how they say it in French. But the point is, Alexander Dumas the writer, junior, if you will, he's technically only a quarter Black, but he looks to the French people of the day in the 1800s. Everybody knew he was Black. One, because everybody knew who his father was. One, they had the same name, but his father was so well known that they knew he was his son. But also he had characteristics that you could tell he was mixed with something. Now, he didn't walk around saying, I'm a Black man per se, but he was discriminated against in a lot of ways because of his Black heritage, if you will. Now, and he had access to white spaces. He was in a lot of privileged places. He earned a lot of money through his writing. So he also was always felt like an outsider. When people wanted to insult him, they would resort to racial slurs. So he definitely had the experience of not being a white man in France. So I was interested in, or I should say, I considered him. We keep him as part of the family, and he fit my category of not white authors in that respect. And also, the book itself, The Count of Monte Cristo, for those who don't know, it's the story of a young French man who is wrongly accused of a crime and put into jail. It turns out the people who set him up for this to be wrongly accused were his former friends. And the whole story, all 1,200 pages, is about what happens when the man gets out of prison and seeks revenge on those who did him dirty. Okay? It feels like a French telenovela, 19th century 19th century telenovela. It is full of romance and intrigue and revenge and fancy clothes and rich people and poor people. And I mean, it is incredible. So it is the perfect type of story to help me understand what does it take to write over 1,200 pages that keeps people engaged 200 years after the book was written. I loved this book. I thought it was fantastic, and I was afraid because it is, I mean, look at how chunky this book is. I was actually stopped in the airport in the Netherlands because that's where I bought this book. They made me unwrap the book because it was wrapped up, because that's how they do books in Europe. I love it. They wrap it up in pretty paper. I don't know. They thought I had a kilo of drugs on me or something. I don't know. But they literally made the security ripped open my book, opened it up like, what is this? I'm like, a book? Anyway, that's how big and juicy and thick this book is. But the fact is, I wanted to learn as a writer, how do we write a book that is so long, so involved, but still keeps people reading, turning pages 200 years after the book was written. So that was my first requirement, was that it aligned with my values as a reader and it aligned with my values as a writer. In other words, what did I want to learn from a book that would compel me to sit down and go through 1,200 pages. So that was the first thing. The next thing, I wanted to make sure that the book was an enjoyable read. I don't want anyone thinking if I'm reading the classics, I'm going to have to trudge through it. It's going to be so boring. I'm going to have to force myself to do it. It feels like homework. Girl, life's too short. Don't do that to yourself. If the book is boring, I don't care if it's a classic, you're not going to really get anything good out of it. So this is your permission slip. If the book isn't keeping your attention, the topic is not something that's, gets you excited, put it down. For me, revenge, I love a good revenge story, okay? So it has to be an enjoyable read. If this book wasn't, even if it's a revenge story, but it was dry and stilted and I couldn't get into it, I would have put it down. But like I said, I loved it. So has to be an enjoyable read. Number 3, one of the things that I think reading the classics is so good for is not only because they're classics, meaning they were written in the past, right? They're not contemporary stories, is that you're also learning about both, you have the opportunity to learn about history and culture in ways that, it's better than doing it just like through a straight history book or something like that. So I think that when you're reading the classics, when you're selecting what book you want to read, again, select a book where you're interested in the cultural and historical times as well, because then you're getting like double benefits out of it, right? So if you're interested in, Russian culture during a certain time period, obviously look for a book written in that time period and in that place, in Russia, for example, or whatever it is you're looking for. So the way that you make sure that reading the classics is going to be not just a useful exercise for you and not just an enjoyable exercise, but you're going to benefit from it on multiple levels, is to also try to select a book where the historical aspect, the cultural aspect is going to add to your knowledge and skill set as a writer and a reader. Now, I want to just share what I did after I finished reading the Count of Monte Cristo, again, I loved it. I was crying. I was laughing. I was like, woohoo, this was so great. Once I finished reading the book, I did a deep dive on Alexander Dumas. That's how come I knew about his father. I learned about how he wrote the book too, which I think is also super helpful. You'll see on YouTube all these like, I tried so-and-so's writing habits. I think when one of the benefits of reading the classics is also learning how these writers created these incredible works. What were the circumstances in which they wrote them? How did they write them? How did they learn how to write? Because again, we are trying to imitate the masters. Well, it's great and it's useful help to see what was their pattern, what was their habit, how did they learn? Because again, if the blueprint exists, all you have to do is follow it. So what I learned about the Count of Monte Cristo is that Alexander Dumas, he wrote this as a serial, right? These were serials in the newspaper. So he wrote it chapter by chapter. And he was such a smart human being. He was paid per word. So when you're like, why is this book so long? Is it, he really just had to tell this story? Well, actually, he just wanted to get paid. No disrespect. He was like, well, if I keep writing, I'll get more money. So that's why he kept going. So it's like learning that. One, it kind of frees you from thinking like, oh, I guess I should write really long stories. Not necessarily. It means that you should write. It means that one, even Alexander Dumas, who is, this amazing writer who's buried in the pantheon, with all of the greats, he was a working writer, just like a lot of us. And he figured out how to make money writing. And again, he had a lot of things going against him. He wasn't born into poverty, but they were very poor. And he figured out how to tell stories that the people wanted. And that was the second part. So he's writing these as serials. And even though some people claimed he was a hack, some people said, he was just writing for the common people. Well, the common people paid for the work. And as a person who's like boldly proclaiming that she wants to write book club fiction, not literary fiction, I have to say, well, Alexander Dumas was writing for the people as well. And he made a lot of money from the books that he wrote this way. And people were hanging on the every word that he said. And hello, why is this is this a Penguin classic? I think it's a Penguin classic. Let me just triple check. But this is a Penguin classic edition. It's lovely. I bought it in the Netherlands, translated. It is one of the most translated works, classics, if you will. So who's laughing now, right? So that gives me, as a writer who is aspiring to write book club fiction, the idea that I'm going to ignore any naysayers who are like, why would you want to write book club fiction? I'm going to ignore my own inner critic that's like, you should be trying to write a more elevated story. No. Alexander Dumas is now somebody who I can look at and say, look what he did. Look how he did it. He followed his own intuition. And a lot of these swashbuckling tales in the Count of Monte Cristo are actually based on his own father's experiences. Okay. So he looked at the world around him. He understood what the people wanted, and he gave the people, stories that they could be talking over at the dinner table. Was the main character Edmond Dantes, was he wrong for seeking revenge? Should he have been kinder? Do you think he should have fallen in love with, should he have gotten back together with his original intended? So much that people could talk about. That's how I want people to deal with my books. So again, studying the writer is just as important as studying the work. All right. Last but not least, because I want my reading experiences, especially when we're reading the classics. And again, usually the classics are, older books. So there's more to consume beside the book itself. It's like after I finished the book and I watched every version of the Count of Monte Cristo film that I could find because I was obsessed, I went to Paris. Now, I had to go to Paris for work anyway, but as a treat, I booked myself into the Monte Cristo Hotel. You can see the pencil. I borrowed it I borrowed it from the hotel. But it is a hotel that is based on the Count of Monte Cristo. And there's a big portrait of Alexander Dumas when you walk in the library. Each room is kind of dedicated to one of the characters from the book. I was like, let's go all the way. So this is what I mean when I say consuming the classics. It doesn't have to end with just reading the book. All right. So I hope that I've inspired you, that you too should be reading the classics so that you can be a better writer. You should be consuming the classics so you can learn about the authors that were the creators of these classics, but you can read the classics and enjoy them. It should not feel like homework. Find the writers that align with your values. Find the stories that are going to mirror the types of stories you want to tell so you can learn from them. And then have a good time digging in to the writer's own story. How did they set about writing these books? What was their situation that made them when they wrote the books? And then if there's other ways to also consume information about the book, so you can really just like dive into the whole experience. That's the great thing again about the classic, is that they're embedded in history, they're embedded in culture. So, do a little bit more to enjoy the experience. Make it a full like 360 full body experience. That's what I did. I love this book so much, and I'll probably read it again. I don't know, when I have time to read another 1200 page book. So I hope that it inspired some of you. I haven't decided what classic I'm reading this year, but of course I'm going to read another classic. But hopefully whatever I choose will allow me to also travel a little bit to experience the book when I finish reading it. If you have any suggestions for me that you think that it will align, it has to be written by a writer of color. It has to be something that would maybe fall under the category of book club fiction. I am open to suggestions. Feel free to leave them in the comments. Thank you so much for listening. I will see you in the next video. Bye.